Okay. Well, look, in which case, we'll make a start. I just want to welcome everyone to what is the latest in a series of global webinars that we're hosting. Today's webinar is really focused upon what global reward brands can achieve for organisations and how to ensure that the global reward brands that we create are meaningful for employees. In terms of the presenters on today's webinar, so there's myself, Adam Mason. I'm the VP of Global and Enterprise here at Benefex, and I'm joined by our subject matter expert, Jess.
Hiya. So I'm Jess, and I'm the senior global communications consultant here at Benefex. I've been working in communications now for around 8 years, and I've worked across a number of global brands, including Salesforce, Nike, BMW, amongst others. My role here is to work directly with our customers from concept to completion. So that's taking them from the initial ideas and understanding what they want to achieve through to creation, the messaging, and then working with them on campaigns.
Fantastic, thank you. So I guess in terms of for us, we work with a wide range of customers across different sectors, different demographics. But I think what we really want to do today is use the opportunity to talk about key themes that are relevant for all organisations when they're thinking about global reward brands. I guess before we kind of dig into that, there's a piece around just what does a global reward brand help you to achieve, and the model on the right hand side is really intended to bring that to life. So there are 4 key pillars or values that we see of benefit from a global reward brand. Firstly, it's about achieving that global framework, but it's a framework that's a foundation upon which cultural and country nuances can be tailored and catered for. So we'll talk a bit about that as we step through the slides today. There's also a really key acknowledgement that a global reward brand really helps kind of support recruitment and retention. Simon Sinek talks a lot about this idea of a war for talent, and the very best people are in short supply. So this is a great way for organisations to be able to differentiate themselves in the marketplace. I want to talk a little bit about the slightly more intangible element, which is how reward brands can help connect people with an organisation and almost foster that culture and community. And without wanting to labour the point, obviously at this present time we're dealing with some extreme circumstances where remote working is a constant. But even in the kind of globally spread organisations, actually this helps to bring countries together and make sure that the way they talk to employees is aligned, regardless of whether you're an employee in Italy or you're an employee in Singapore, for example. And then the last piece that's a really key benefit of a global reward brand is actually, for employees, they will be met with a number of different calls upon their time in a day. The work that they're doing for yourselves, whether that be through email, collaboration tools, there's lots of calls upon their time. And so actually what a reward brand is able to do is actually hopefully cut through that noise. And when we think about outcomes, it's that outcome of hopefully getting people to engage with that content and therefore ultimately engage with their benefits as well. So, this is quite a helpful framework just in terms of us thinking about, what's the value of a global reward brand. And I'm not going to labour this slide too much. It's one that we regularly feature as part of these webinars, but it's just the acknowledgement for global organisations. Typically, there are 3 scenarios. So there's a scenario where an organisation might have in-country reward and benefits specialists in every single country that they're in. That is incredibly rare and tends to be for only the very largest organisations. Much more common is what I would describe as scenarios 2 and 3. So one scenario might be you have simply a centralized approach to benefits, and therefore benefit strategy and the rollout of things like a global reward brand sit very much within one team based in one particular country. And it's that challenge of how do you recognize the different nuances without having those specialists on the ground. But perhaps the more common scenario that we see is where you've got kind of regional hubs in terms of the approach to reward benefits. So it might be that you have kind of APAC being led out of Singapore and the US and the Latin Americas being led out of the States, but you still haven't got necessarily that feet on the ground, but you have got a little bit more of a kind of country specialism in those scenarios. But for us, a reward brand is particularly powerful in all 3 of those situations, and that's hopefully what we'll bring to life during the course of this presentation. Now, I don't want to take away the kind of content that Jess is going to step us through, but the kind of 4 key things that we wanted to talk about in terms of how you achieve your global reward brand is successful are kind of captured on this slide. So one is about, if you invest the time and energy in a global reward brand, it's really important that there's that commitment to consistency. There's a piece then about how it looks and appears to employees, both in terms of the images that are used and the primary colours that are adopted, and we'll talk about how different cultures can interpret those in different ways. There's a piece then about actually from a technical level, how do you kind of communicate with those employees in terms of the tone of voice or the language that you adopt? And then finally, one of the things that we find is incredibly powerful in terms of ensuring the success of a global reward brand is making the employees feel part of the design. And Jess will just talk through some practical experience of where that's been the case. So Jess, do you want to take us through a couple of those themes?
Absolutely, yeah. So I guess one of the first key things to consider when you're launching a new global brand is how it translates across the different media. So when you're rolling out globally, you'll quite often find different countries will be used to seeing printed materials particularly. So in the US, it's quite common for printed collateral to go out, so whether that's in offices or in terms of home mailing. Whereas within a lot of countries within Asia, you tend to find it's a lot more focused around digital. So it's just making sure that those different elements within your brand and all the different assets will carry across print and digital. So considerations such as fonts, certain more sort of the elaborate script fonts that you can see on the screen there work really freely on print and within graphics, but a lot of email providers only allow website fonts, for example. So it's just ensuring you've got different options to cover different scenarios based on the media you'll be sending out across the different countries. And once you've got those variations in place, just making sure that those guidelines are set up really clearly, so the different owners within countries know what their boundaries are, and that's very much linked to Adam's previous slides, where you've got different people within different countries who may know more or less about the brand, and making sure that they know their guidelines within that, so that everything's created, no matter where it's come from, really looks instantly recognisable as a reward brand, whether it's an email, a poster, or a PowerPoint presentation.
And yeah, just to build upon Jess's point there, I think one of the things that we found prove really successful with a lot of our global customers is this idea almost of a toolkit. And it's really coming back to this idea of framework assets which different countries are able to draw upon. So, when we look at any particular organisation, we may find that certain channels of communication work particularly well, whether that be kind of email or kind of road shows or platforms. But we can then really think at a slightly deeper level about, what are all the different options that may be applicable for a country, but acknowledging that each country may have different needs based upon their demographics or what the cultural norm is. So when we're thinking about a global toolkit, it's almost getting to a place where we've got that kind of consistent group of assets that actually at a country level, we can then draw upon, certain of those assets to be able to utilize in country. So let's say there are 10 or 15 things that are part of that global toolkit. We might only use 8 for a particular country, but they're the 8 that are right for that country, rather than finding that we're just covering every single form of communication. We're trying to tailor it based upon what will work best in country, but acknowledging that if we've got that kind of toolkit to be able to draw upon, going back to Jess's point, you really achieve that kind of consistency in the way that you approach the communications with employees. And we've seen that really taken to kind of that next layer of detail. So you might have a global toolkit that focuses on countries that have an enrolment, and a global toolkit that focuses on countries that don't have an enrolment. And again, it's really there to kind of guide and inform people in country to think, okay, what could I do? What might be relevant without not giving them a completely blank page to begin from, helping to guide and inform what might work best.
Brilliant. So I guess the next key thing for us is looking at tone and translation. They're such a key component of global branding and communications, and it's just a really common trap to fall into, where you sometimes have a tagline or messaging that needs to be far-reaching, but just doesn't correspond. So you can see on the screen a couple of examples that have been and perhaps haven't been done so well. Pampers, for example, they began selling nappies in Japan without seeing much success. They did a bit of digging, and it turns out that branding, which depicts the folklore story of storks delivering babies, was completely unknown in Japan, and apparently their story instead goes that giant floating peaches deliver babies. So Pampers' meanings were all lost, as they knew nothing about that. Similarly, with a leading global drinks manufacturer used their slogan, "Brings you back to life," in China, just as they had done in other countries, which unfortunately translated much more closely to "Brings your ancestors back from the grave," which is just a very clear example of how not doing your research and using direct translations just has not worked in their favour. However, McDonald's, when they launched their "I'm Loving It" campaign slogan, and they did that really well, they launched within a lot of countries, and they all had something of their own adaptation of "I'm Loving It." So it made sense to them, but kept that sentiment. So in France, it translates to "That's what I like," and in Chinese, "I just like it." So they're just a couple of examples of where taking a look at any strap lines, key messages, and campaign names, and what they mean globally within your countries. And it can help determine whether you go for a straight translation. So that's directly translating word for word, similar to what the drinks manufacturer did, although they didn't do it very well, or a transcreation, which actually adapts the wording so that it means something locally, but keeps the sentiment, similar to McDonald's example.
Thank you. And language is a really interesting one, because it's typically a real conversation point at the start of a project for us. There is a fine balance to be struck between the complexity of communicating in multiple languages and then that benefit for employees. And when we think about the benefit for employees, there's a recent Gallup survey that was done that talked about the fact that 9 out of 10 internet users typically tended to visit the website of their own language. And perhaps more relevant to this conversation is this idea that 42% said they would never purchase products and services in other languages. Now, when we acknowledge that, when we're thinking about benefits, there are, risk benefits that extend to coverage for perhaps dependents. Actually, it's an area where, employees may feel some sense of vulnerability about having to engage within a language that isn't their native tongue. So actually, we have worked with a number of customers, as is demonstrated on this right-hand side here, where we've almost catered for not just the business language, but through a simple toggle, through a simple click, the whole brochure then converts to a different language. And it therefore gives the employee that ability to be able to engage with the content in perhaps a language that they're more comfortable with, acknowledging that, as I say, there may be a sense of vulnerability around certain benefits where they just feel more comfortable making those selections when it's in their native language. There is a kind of trade-off though, as I say, both in terms of complexity, and we work with lots of customers where actually they say, do you know what, I have a business language that is a unifying trait across all of our countries, and I want to adopt that. It's quite common. Some organizations in that situation will say, I just want to stick to, for example, US English, and I will deliver my benefits material in that single language. We've got some where, as I say, this particular example here just draws out where you might have your business language, but also cater for the kind of country language at the same time.
Lovely. So similarly to looking at translations of wording and content, it's really important that you look at the use of images and colours, as Adam mentioned earlier. So, if you're looking at photography within your branding, just make sure that you have either a relevant specific set of imagery available to use in different countries, or perhaps even location-specific images of cities or landmarks where they'll be used, or even offering just a wide range of images that offer variety, so more generic landscapes, for example, that can be used across all the countries. It's also true for people-focused imagery. Ensuring that you have plenty of diversity and range within your bank of images is so important when you're rolling out globally and can be looking at countries from around the world. And then sort of similarly to very much to that is, make sure you're considering your primary and secondary colour palette. It's really common for certain colours to mean something quite specific within certain countries. Purple, for example, is quite often considered royalty and wealth within many European countries, whereas in North America, it's a colour very strongly associated with mourning and sorrow. So just making sure you're considering what those colours that you're using may mean, where you'll be rolling those out. Blue, however, is generally considered the most neutral colour, and the most positive across lots of countries. So that's just one little thing to consider when you're working on yours. And just making sure that what you're doing is translating across the countries is that real key step to making sure that brand you're creating is truly global. Very similarly, the consideration of physical elements. So, for example, what colours using colours together could mean for people with colour blindness, and colour combining and colour contrasting can really affect someone who who's colour blind, and just making sure that you're taking those into consideration as you're working through colours. And finally, just making sure, I think, your employees are engaged is so important. They are the ones at the end of the day who will live and breathe your brand. So making sure they feel part of it right from the beginning, and from launch and beyond, and as you move forward, is so important. And there's so many ways you can get them engaged. And a key one we found, as Adam mentioned, is that getting them involved from the start. Hosting employee workshops where we can get their input is so important. Finding out what's important to them and the values, the styles they want to see, and what direction they would like their reward brand to go into. From there, you can begin consolidating their input. You can feed into wider stakeholder groups and hold more workshops with them, and where you begin to develop mood boards similar to what you can see on the screen here, which we created for Lockton. And then finally, you can see on the this slide how it gets refined from that concept through to execution and really develops into a full brand. The insight that we gained really pushed us in a clear direction and took us away from the classic corporate branding you might see into something really unique and bright and different, and that we knew the employees wanted to see. And make sure you take it full circle. Make sure once you're ready to launch, you do it with a splash. Communicate that rollout and really excite your employees and show them how their insight that they gave you came to life, and make sure you can make them as passionate about this as they are.
Thanks, Jess. So I guess really just before we go to the questions that we've had raised during the course of this, and please feel free to add any others as we're kind of approaching the question point, but I wanted to try and frame or a key takeaway in terms of the role of a global reward brand. And I think it's just acknowledging that, you would have heard Benefex talk very passionately about the importance that we believe an employee experience plays for employees. I guess for us, within that employee experience, benefits and the benefits that you provide to employees are a key part of that employee experience. And by the same token, the brand and what that resonates for that employee are also another key aspect of that employee experience. Now, for us, when we're looking at reward brand, it's interesting because that almost traverses those two. So for your employer brand, it can help kind of really enhance what that means, when we're thinking about some of the elements of reward that you offer for employees. But when we're thinking about benefits, actually, it plays a really interesting role in terms of it almost breathes life into those individual benefits. And, one of the things that we'll be showcasing as part of future webinars on the subject of branding is actually where organizations have almost used this to bring to life, their well-being pillars, for example, that they may have, in place globally. So it almost proves to be that tool in terms of both reinforcing the employer brand that exists, but also thinking about how do you breathe real life and meaning into the benefits that you offer to employees, regardless of where you are in the country, through that kind of consistent framework or description of how we talk to benefits as a whole. Okay, what I'll do is I can see we've had a couple of questions come through, so just take the opportunity whilst we've got Jess on with us to kind of make sure that we're tapping into that expert knowledge and covering questions that have been posed. So Jess, the first one I can see that we've got here is we talk a little bit about flexibility for stakeholders outside of the kind of main hubs or at country level. It'd be interesting just to understand, how much flexibility do you kind of typically allow countries to have when it comes to a global reward brand?
Yeah, absolutely. So I guess the broader answer is it really can depend on your organisation. I guess some are much more flexible inherently, while others aren't so much. So taking your company's values and ways of working as a starting point is key. And there are different ways. I guess you can allow more flexibility. Images, for example, we'll quite often find in a global brand we'll have a set bank of images, but you could perhaps rather than having a set bank of images they can use, offer image direction instead. So guiding people as to whether they should or shouldn't be using people focused imagery. If they are using people focused imagery, what direction they should use for that. Even considering something like a colour wash on top of your images and just providing details like that to different countries so they know that flexibility they've got within that, but how to keep it still looking the same. And very much, I guess, looking at in terms of how you can do that with messaging. We found, I know Adam briefly touched on this earlier, that where we've been working on some global toolkits that have said to country, to enrolment. So where we have some countries launching with an enrolment, some without, and just making sure that the messaging there is as we want it to be. So we found a quite strong way of doing that is setting an introduction and setting a conclusion, but allowing the call to action, like the middle bit, the call to action, where we're actually defining what employees in that country need to do, and giving that more flexibility and scope to be updated. I hope that was your question.
Yeah, no, thanks, Jess. Thanks. Do you want to cover the next question that we've got there?
Yeah, absolutely. So, next question. As an organisation, we've been developing well-being pillars. Can you explain how that can be translated and incorporated into a reward brand?
Yeah, so I'll take this one actually. So I think for us the key is really making sure that as part of that brand creation exercise we're aware of what those reward pillars are. I'm hoping to be joined by Salesforce, who we work with quite closely on this globally in terms of they have a very specific well-being brand, and so we've made sure that actually the reward brand that we're looking to approach on the platform talks to that kind of well-being brand that they have. And just to kind of build that up, it is incredibly common now for organisations to have these kind of key well-being pillars, through which it's almost the thematic approach to how you might talk around an individual benefit. So rather than just talking about a medical plan, you talk about health as a pillar, of which there are a number of different plans that exist as part of that overarching strategy. So, it's really important that we're kind of aware of those pillars, because actually it's a great way of giving benefits more meaning, and actually the reward brand should help support that narrative rather than compete or conflict with it in any way. There's an interesting one here, Jess, which is just, is there a brand that you particularly enjoyed working on, and maybe not the name, but it'd be good just to understand what was a part of that brand and what meant it was quite so successful.
Yeah, absolutely. So there's, I guess one comes to mind where we did get to create a really exciting different brand, something that I think probably we hadn't really got to work on before. They came from I guess their initial guidelines that they have internally, as so their external guidelines were fairly simple, and we really got to take that away and get insight from all the wider teams in terms of what they want to see, and what they want to achieve. And we got to that way, and I worked really closely with our creative team, so our team of designers and our team of copywriters, and we really got stuck in within our creative sessions and managed to create something really different and really exciting, and getting the opportunity to present that back to the customers and watching it go live, and receiving feedback within that from within the surveys we send out and things like that. It was such a nice thing to be part of.
Fantastic. And I think the survey piece is an interesting one, because I think typically where we've worked with customers and they've looked to kind of launch a new reward brand, it's really important that they kind of obtain that feedback and get the opportunity to build upon it, because it shouldn't just be about launch, it should be about what you do with the reward brand then going forward. Okay, well, absolutely. Perfect. Well, look, I guess at that point, I'll bring the webinar to a close. Just to say, this is the latest in a series of global webinars that we're hosting, and we are looking to, as I mentioned earlier on, do a bit of a customer case study, which I think will just build upon this reward brand point in terms of actually how do you use a broad reward brand to then tactically think about the communications of benefits. In the meantime, though, if you've got any questions or comments, we'd love to hear from you. So please do get in touch. I've included both mine and Jess's contact details on there. But at that point, I'll bring the webinar to a close. Wish you all a great rest of the day, regardless of which time zone you're in at the moment. And thank you again.
Thanks, everyone.